As a fully grown millennial man-child, the last time I gawped at the TV with an open mouth was when Astro gave me a brand new level of Ape Escape. It's been a very long time since the last proper Ape Escape adventure, so I was pretty jazzed to hop around a colourful level, play with some gadgets, and snatch up some cheeky monkeys to a drum and bass soundtrack just like the good old days. Playing through such a charming new slice of an otherwise retired old favourite was a very bittersweet moment for me. I love those damn apes, and I'll always be ready in case they escape. But don't just take my nostalgia for it. These games have held up incredibly well, and I can honestly say that the humour and gameplay are just as entertaining now as they were back then. Having all that fun with the added sheen of modern graphics, you just can't shake that feeling of being a bit shortchanged by this segment. There's nothing dated about funny monkeys or 3D platformers, so I don't see any reason why this series has to stay dead, while others were given another shot at mainstream success. All this would certainly sting a lot more, if not for the package this level came wrapped up in. Astro is one of the best games Sony has ever made, and it's my favourite AAA game to come along in years. Nothing about it reinvents the wheel, but it's a delightful game from front to back that never runs out of creative steam, and is just relentless with how hard it works to entertain you. The rhythm of its gameplay and movement are tuned to perfection. Outstanding level variety will keep you hooked. Its use of the DualSense controller is second to none, and it just exudes a joy from being played, as if it's grateful that you're the one that picked it up and brought it home. I didn't want it to end, and the closer I got to the finish line, the more I began to ration out my play sessions just to extend that honeymoon period. Astro is the real deal, and while I don't want to go overboard about it, it's the rare kind of game that didn't give me a single moment of frustration, boredom, or a yearning for certain aspects to be better fleshed out. It was very nice just to turn off my stupid little YouTuber brain and enjoy the ride for once. I was also very naughty when Astro came out, staying up way past my bedtime because I just couldn't wait to see what crazy new level or obscure old PlayStation character was around the next corner. For much of that first playthrough, my girlfriend sat next to me on the couch because it was just easier than calling her into the room every 5 minutes when something amazing happened. Whenever we'd rescue a new bot, she'd say, "Oh, who's that?" And I'd say, "Ugh, obviously that's Mr. Mosquito from the 2001 PS2 classic Mr. Mosquito. God, don't you know anything?" As someone that grew up with each iteration of the PlayStation and dove into a lot of niche titles after reading about them in PlayStation Magazine, a guy like me is the perfect demographic for Astro. Am I being pandered to? Yeah, a little bit, but it's hard to care when the material used hasn't seen love in decades. Believe it or not, there was once a time when first-party PlayStation games weren't all cinematic experiences with an over-the-shoulder camera. The PS1, 2, and even 3 featured a very eclectic and interesting range of games that often bordered on experimental. Nowadays, these games are the sort of thing you'd expect to see from the indie scene, but back then, Sony were bankrolling these wacky projects themselves to ensure that PlayStation was a platform for every kind of player. That ambition to capture entirely new markets paid off immensely, and alongside incredible third-party support, it's the reason why the PS1 and 2 had a galaxy of great games to enjoy. I was very surprised at just how niche the references to this period can go. I mean, when was the last time you thought about Mad Maestro, or Robert the Robot Rabbit? And while the absence of any Squaresoft characters is a bit odd, Team Asobi still knocked it out of the park at representing every era of PlayStation. Gotta say, I was pretty disappointed at the lack of a Chad Warden Astrobot, but I suppose he is a relic of a different time.
Man, they best rename that shit to Galo 3.
Collecting these old dudes is just the icing on an already brilliant game, but I couldn't stop thinking about how weird all this must be if you have no idea who any of these characters are. I just can't imagine putting myself into the shoes of a young kid playing this today and being completely bewildered at the sight of all these obscure characters. Or can I?
Super Smash Brothers!
As a young lad in the early 2000s, playing Melee was a fascinating and pleasantly confusing experience. I didn't know who the hell Ness was. I honestly thought he was Mario's son or had something to do with the Blues Brothers. Why is this stage inside a prehistoric Game Boy I've never heard of, and what are these two handsome Sailor Moon villains doing in my Super Mario fighting game? Melee captured my imagination in a very unique way, and digging into its trophies only increased my curiosity for this strange world of ancient or completely inaccessible Nintendo games. As an arrogant young kid, you think you know everything about the toys and media you spend time with after school. The world of the GameCube felt like a domain that belonged only to me and my friends. Playing Melee gave me the very humbling realization that the hobby I thought I knew so much about was actually much older and far more complicated than I could comprehend. I didn't know anything about anything. I was just the newest generation of young consumers being courted by a very old corporation called Nintendo. Still, nothing about that new feeling put me off Melee, and if anything, it just drove me to play the hell out of it to unlock more trophies and read extra nuggets of Nintendo history. A lot of these games were completely inaccessible to me at the time, so imagination filled in the blanks until I discovered Nintendo's archenemy a few years later and got myself up to speed. These are fond memories to me, and I'm sure they're very relatable to a lot of people who grew up playing Melee. On Nintendo's end, a common story like mine is proof that Smash Bros. Has been an enormously successful way to introduce tentpole franchises to new players and gauge potential interest in reviving old ones. Earthbound's popularity in the West got a huge shot in the arm thanks to Ness and Lucas. The appearance of Marth and Roy was a key factor in Nintendo's choice to begin localizing Fire Emblem. And despite being a fairly obscure character from the 80s, fans loved Pit so much that Nintendo resurrected Kid Icarus to great critical acclaim and commercial success. For every new generation of Nintendo player, Smash Bros. Has been there to offer a crash course on the company's history. A shiny new Trojan horse to get the kids interested in characters they might otherwise see as old and crusty. In the mid-2000s, emulators like Z-SNES and Project 64 allowed curious young fans like me to play all that history for ourselves. And now that Nintendo has met that demand for classic gaming with their own service, they've been on a warpath to make their emulator the only game in town. It's a grim situation we've found ourselves in, and a real kick in the nuts for anyone who isn't a Nintendo shareholder. But of all the horrible things you could say about Nintendo, you've got to admit, they've always valued even their most niche franchises and provided an avenue to legally access them since the Wii days. The same can't be said for Sony. During the PS4 era, they didn't give a hoot about these old games and assumed everyone else was on the same page. And at a time when amazing backwards compatibility became a selling point for the Xbox One, it reflected very badly on Sony to ignore their own back catalogue the way they did. Possibly inspired by the outpouring of love for Astro's Playroom, Sony has now begun to take its own history a lot more seriously. Slowly but surely, a lot of old classics are making their way onto the PlayStation Store. It can't compare to the massive library of the old PS3 network, and the quality of their in-house emulator is honestly shocking, but regardless, it's still a step in the right direction. As a nerd watching a small channel like mine, you're probably thinking, why not just use a PC emulator? They're free and better in every conceivable way. And I agree. I wouldn't pay $15 for this shit, and neither should you until they get their act together. And while PC emulation has never been more accurate or user-friendly than it is right now, that doesn't mean companies should just leave their history in the hands of the community. No matter how sophisticated fan emulators are, there will always be a huge number of people who just want an accessible way to buy and play old games on their current console, and major companies should always be there to meet that need in some capacity. If you want your old favorites back from the dead, services like these need to exist, so companies can gauge the profitability of producing sequels or remakes. And you'd be surprised at just how many obscure games featured in Astro are available for purchase right now on the PlayStation Store. I love that it's an easy way for curious players to jump right into the full adventures of those characters without leaving the PS5. So why play God of War when you could just play Mr. Mosquito?
This feels so good.
Old Sony IPs, especially those from Japan Studio, won't ever have the same cult-like fanaticism that Nintendo franchises do. As much as I love them, and believe me I do, they just don't have the same star power of Mario, Zelda, or Pokemon. These guys have had their day in the sun, and a high school reunion in the form of Astro, but the past is likely where the majority of them will stay. Despite all that, I still have this hope that for some clueless kid out there, Astro will do for them what Melee did for me. With those classic characters front and center in a terrific new platformer, and the titles they belong to accessible for the first time in years, I hope the new generation of PlayStation fans realize that this brand wasn't always about homogeneous movie games. And if Melee could inspire me to play a game like Earthbound, then surely Astrobot can turn some Fortnite kids into Ape Escape fans. As for Astro himself, I'm very excited for whatever's next. My only concern is the potential for this series to become pigeonholed as a vehicle for Sony nostalgia. This game was the best birthday present PlayStation could have asked for, and an equally nostalgic sequel just wouldn't carry the same weight. Like Smash Bros., it serves as a charming museum for all the fun that came before it. But imagine how off-putting Smash Ultimate would feel if the majority of these characters hadn't seen a new game since the GameCube or N64 days. That hamster wheel of retro fan service is a trap which Astrobot could very easily fall into. And if Sony doesn't intend to actually revive any of these old franchises, then let's not ruin such a perfect send-off with further attempts to cash in on our love for the past. Astro is a wonderful little man who deserves a universe all to himself, and I just hate to see him stuck as the pallbearer for all these dead Sony characters when he should be blasting off into new adventures of his own.